the garden where the red rose blows. Oh, I want to go. Softly like a flower, cuddle me an hour. For lovely, let me learn that the red rose red.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we mingle in the Stanley Rose Bookshop, Vine Street near Hollywood, 1932. This chapter has Saroyan loafing around the bookstore. He and writer John Fonte, a bit younger than him, crossed the street from the bookstore to grab cigarettes and found an illicit gambling ring in the back of a tobacco shop. Saroyan followed others into it and bet on horses using $3 of his $3.80 savings. He figured he'd just have to hitchhike back to the bosom of San Francisco if he lost it all. Waiting for the race to complete, he paid a visit to the photographer Peter Hancock in the same building. Hancock took a series of portraits of Saroyan, and then Saroyan and Fonte left to check on the races. His horses won, and the gamblers respectfully made a path for Saroyan to collect his winnings at almost $100. He stayed in town 2 more weeks. This was a pretty good metaphor for the 1930s for him. Before his short fiction took off, William tried his hand at screenwriting in Hollywood. In the 1930s, and for a couple decades more, it was popular for short story writers and novelists to write screenplays, it being a good way to make quick money and with little visibility of critics. This is where Saroyan rubbed shoulders with Nathaniel West, another of Rose's favorites and who wrote The Day of the Locust about the absurdity of Hollywood. At Rose's bookshop, writers gathered to grumble about Hollywood and the rat race, which they were often grudgingly trying to break into. Saroyan made inquiries, found some pleasure in writing scenarios for movies, which is a sort of precursor to a script, and sought help from Rose to get him in. While he did find some work, it wasn't satisfying or working well for him, and Saroyan went back to San Francisco. Of course, he continued to interact with Hollywood, writing the story for The Human Comedy, selling options for some of his plays, and writing short scripts for the 1950s television series Omnibus. But he felt Hollywood was phonier than most and stuck close to Stanley Rose. Here you can see he was submitting under a pen name, John Hamilcar. Stanley Rose was an important figure to Saroyan. He was a stalwart supporter of Saroyan early on, and was well known in early Hollywood. He was a bookseller, eventually a literary agent, gambler, drinker, and his bookshop is where writers congregated in L.A. He had a Texas drawl and took Saroyan and others on so-called hunting trips near the Mexican border, where they geared up to hunt and then ended up drinking in a bar or betting on the races instead. Rose operated several bookstore locations over the 1920s and 30s that served Hollywood studio workers. The Satyr on Vine Street was next to the famous Brown Derby that attracted celebrities, and this is probably what it was called when Saroyan was there in 1932. This would come to be known as the Stanley Rose Bookstore, and then its location moved entirely to Hollywood Boulevard, where it was famously near Mosso and Frank's Grill, that was a popular meeting spot for celebrities and Hollywood types. Rose and his boys would drink at Mosso and Frank's or in the back room of his bookstore where, as Saroyan put it, writers just loafed around. They became known as the Boys in the Back Room, and this was the title of Edmund Wilson's book about those who frequented Rose's shop at that time. It was at this location that the shop gained a small amount of fame, although Rose wasn't a particularly good businessman, and the bookstore as a retail business didn't thrive as much as it did as a gathering place for intellectuals. By 1941, the bookstore was closed, and Rose was attempting various other odd jobs, including a nominal term as Saroyan's literary agent. He and Saroyan grew close, and Saroyan dedicates a chapter to Rose in Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever, which paints a vivid picture of the influence of the bookstore in the 1930s. At Stanley Rose's bookshop on Hollywood Boulevard, I met a lot of published writers, famous writers, hack writers, scenario writers, unpublished writers, and would-be writers. The would-be writers invariably said, "I do a little scribbling, too." And of course, The minute I heard that remark, I knew I was speaking to somebody likely to give Mark Twain a very short run for his money. He described Rose lovingly as a con man. He had also been a bootlegger, and in his early days in Hollywood, before opening the bookstore, he had done a little time. He had also dealt in what he called dirty books. He seemed to be able to speak about his past as if it really hadn't been shabby at all, or as if it hadn't involved himself. He certainly hadn't reformed. He had only grown into other activities. Saroyan admired this. He described him as one of his best friends, from the time he met him until Rose died 20 years later. Rose also kept an art gallery in the back of his store, where he featured emerging artists in that medium as well. In Suns Come and Go, Saroyan describes it, "In those days, Stanley Rose exhibited paintings in a gallery at the back of his bookshop. I may or may not have seen some of Fletcher Martin's paintings on the walls of this gallery before meeting him, but I know that soon after we had met, I did see a number of his paintings. I remember also, to sum up as quickly as possible the long ago, that on Friday nights for a couple of weeks, Fletcher Martin and I went to the Hollywood Legion Arena to see the fights." Saroyan appreciated art and made some himself, though he realized his truest natural talent lay in writing. He befriended many artists in his life, and Fletcher Martin is one that he knew for many years, and would write a foreword to the book Fletcher Martin in 1954, a tribute to the artist. Rose would also serve as his literary agent, though it was largely honorary. Rose was in the room when negotiations for the human comedy rights at MGM were made, though he didn't participate much. Mostly Saroyan wanted to repay him for all of the good, loyal years Rose had given him, fostering him as a young writer, buying him meals, encouraging him, and even trying to publish his stories with Bud Schulberg. He and Schulberg struggled to arrange the stories that Random House had rejected, and their endeavor failed. Eventually the volume 3x3 would be released by 3 college students at UCLA. Rose had called the story for the human comedy the greatest story ever written for moving pictures, which pleased Saroyan along with all the other loyal things Rose did for him in the 1930s. Saroyan wrote in Suns Come and Go, "There were several reasons why Stanley Rose was my agent. In the first place, he had informed me while I was rolling dice in Las Vegas that he could get me a job at MGM for big weekly money in case I wanted a job. In the second place, he was bankrupt, owing to the fact that almost all of his Hollywood customers owed him great sums of money, but refused to pay, or paid only in very small installments. Well, somebody had to be my agent in any case. Why not Stanley Rose?" Saroyan didn't have a lot of close friends. He kept a few family members close, like Archie and Kirk Manassian, and at times Ross Bagdasarian, but he didn't trust many outsiders. In an industry of backstabbing and plagiarism, there weren't many loyal and true friends to be had among his writing peers. Stanley Rose was an exception here because he stood by Saroyan before Saroyan was famous and after. He was a rare close pal, and his early death was painful for Saroyan, and probably the others who appreciated the bon ami he so purposely fostered in his joint. It was at the bookshop that Saroyan befriended writer John Fante. Fante, though slightly younger than Saroyan, had struck up a connection to one of Saroyan's idols, H.L. Mencken. Fante was already being published in Mencken's American Mercury, and Saroyan admired that. The two young men had some things in common, including their immigrant backgrounds and being from the West. Fante was from Denver, Colorado. Fante came to be known for his series of novels about Italian Americans, though he made his living mostly in screenwriting in the 1950s. In 1940, Fante wrote a biting review for the New York Herald Tribune books about My Name is Aram, but he and Saroyan were still gambling together in the 1950s and still meeting in the late 70s. In this chapter, we again see Saroyan being Saroyan. He's betting on horses almost compulsively when the opportunity randomly presents itself, and he was living a fairly loose and wild life traveling between Hollywood and San Francisco, as funds allowed. His 20s were a productive time for him, but he was observing as much as he was writing. complaining about the suits in Hollywood and the trashy movies being written and produced is hallowed ground among writers to this day. So even before he had made it big with The Daring Young Man, he was already getting to know his field, his peers, and the expected behaviors of young writers. Gambling and drinking were pretty popular. Stanley Rose was a mentor, perhaps more so than Mencken and the others who only sent encouraging letters to Saroyan. The 1930s were good to Saroyan, maybe the best, and this is a snapshot of his salad days, and one he looks fondly on. This is perhaps Saroyan at his most nostalgic, maybe even more so than his childhood in Fresno, because this was him on his own, where he wanted to be, doing what he wanted to do, finally free to make his own decisions, following his dreams and finding success as he worked his way into fame. This was a special time in American arts, as Hollywood blossomed, literature and huge painted murals addressed the working class, all of which we have come to know as quintessentially American. A peek into this world is one that readers are lucky to get, and lovers of California history also get insight into what was happening in the upstart town of Hollywood early on. Again, after a rough chapter at the Whitelands house, this is dessert to thank us for coming along. And it's tasty. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.